It is 1 o'clock on April 28th. This is a meeting of the Land Use Review Board. I am Janet Hurley, the chair. I'm going to do a roll call of the board members and then hopefully introductions across the room. So,
Kirsten Sultan.
Alex Weinhagen.
Brooke Dingleby.
Sarah. And can we start with Kevin?
Sure. Kevin Anderson, I'm the district coordinator.
Section Deputy Director of the Vermont County Planning Commission.
Tasha Wallace, Director, Vermont County Planning.
And the people who are speaking, remember that they're not just talking to the board members, but people farther away as well. Understand?
Tasha Wallace, Executive Director of the Vermont County Planning Commission.
Thank you, Tasha.
David Susie, District 5 Commission.
There in the coordinator for District 5.
Mars District 5 Chair.
Let's go to Maddie.
Maddie Cotter, Legal Technician.
Jenny Ranas, Associate General Counsel. Eli Tui, I'm the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission.
Brian Boyd, Senior Planner and Program Manager at the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission.
Savino, Planner at Central Vermont Planning Commission.
Planner and Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission.
And let's get,
Thomas Weiss, I'm stakeholder in the fields, group stakeholder. Resident of Montpelier.
Ed Stanek, resident of Harrison.
and then let's go to the back row.
I am Catherine God, District Technician for District 5. Alex Master, Officer with the board.
Bill, Executive Director of the board.
All the board, I work on the scanning project for activity. Rachel Monaco, Business Director for the board. And Lauren, Legal Technician for the board.
Thank you, everybody. And who do we have online? We have Rebecca and Annette. And
Annette Smith, Vermonters for a Clean Environment.
thank you, Annette.
Aaron Brondike, Act 250 State Coordinator.
That was Aaron. Aaron got swallowed up by the internet. And Rebecca.
Good afternoon. This is Rebecca Chalifo. I'm one of the staff attorneys, or the staff attorney with the Land Use Review Board.
Thank you. Before we jump into further introductions and comments, are there any updates to the agenda? I forgot to ask that. No, thank you. So this is the 5th of our series of in-person meetings at district locations. And we started in Essex. We made our way around the state. We've invited district commissioners, district staffers to come and have a conversation with us along with the regional planning commissions. Just comments that you may have for the board, questions that you may have for the board, anything. So, anybody feel like starting?
Do you want us to break the ice and give them a
Nope.
little heads up about
Sure.
what we're up to?
Yeah, why don't we?
We've been
that's a good
doing that
idea.
at some of the other meetings, just so you know what each of the board members is working
Yeah.
on. But do you want to start, Kirsten?
Sure. So in addition to overseeing sort of program operations, Act 250 is already, in operation, obviously. We are responsible for various studies and rulemaking as part of Act 181. And so the one of those studies that I've taken the lead on concerns wood products manufacturing and how that particular sector is regulated through Act 250, looking to find ways to improve how that regulation occurs through 250 and possibly looking at it more holistically, including A&R permits. So I'm the lead on that particular study, and I've been bringing information back and forth to the board and organizing a stakeholder group. Study is the first one due, the current due date is June 30th. Alex.
And we have lots of other projects. Kirsten is also helping us think about
tier 2, which is one of the 2 tiers that we're thinking about, and our road rule, right? Whether or not we need clarification on the road rule that was reintroduced into Act 250 last year with Act 181. So I'm Alex Weinhagen. I come to the board from the town of Heinsberg. I've been in municipal government for over 20 years. And I volunteered to lead on 2 of our rulemaking efforts. So the board is charged with making rules for tier 3 and for a new review criterion that the district commissions would be using under Act 250. The criterion 8C, which is related to forest blocks and habitat connectors. So the board will be undertaking rulemaking on both of those efforts. And the tier 3 process has begun. The criterion 8C process will begin later this summer. And excitedly, we had our first working group or stakeholder meeting last week. It went really well. We're having another one on May 8th, and then we'll be entertaining feedback from everyone else on May 22nd with a public engagement session that evening.
Janet Hurley. My background is also municipal and regional planning, as well as some biology here and there throughout the last few decades. And I have been taking the lead on the regional plan approval process. So we are, we've talked about that in the last several meetings, and we're going to be putting together guidelines to hopefully be ready to accept the first plans that will be coming to us as soon as September. We have asked for one a month, and we're hoping that the regional planning commissions help us with that. Till we get through them all this first round. The other thing that I've taken the lead on is that we have certain responsibilities now under the environmental justice law. And primarily that is that we need to develop a community engagement plan with particular attention to environmental justice communities as they are being mapped by the state.
Brooke Dingle Dean. My background is a litigation and land use attorney for the past 30 years. At a local firm here in Barrie, Delsey Jack American Florida Northwest. I now moved on instead of being in the trenches to hopefully be able to help to implement the changes of Act 181. And I'm thrilled to be on a board of people with really diverse backgrounds, because I think that is such a strength through this process. I have been tasked with taking over the appeals study, which is more of a look at how consolidation of appeals, A&R, as well as zoning and Act 250 might be able to be consolidated before the board, and compare that to the court consolidation or coordination that occurs now. Also to look to see if there's a way to speed up municipal housing appeals because of the housing crisis that we face. And as part of the study, we're also linking into our environmental justice obligations to, during one of our stakeholder meetings, to actually look at some kind of ombuds office, ombuds person to help not only the public to engage in the Act 250 process, but also permittees. We heard during the wood products manufacturing stakeholder meeting, folks expressed a need for what used to be called the permit specialist at Agency of Natural Resources. And that's been replaced with a computer navigator system, which we heard was useful, but only for sophisticated folks who had an engineer, for professionals to help them with the process or who had a lot of experience themselves. So we've heard a lot about NIMBYism and making sure that people can access the system with the right information. And then that burden does not fall only on our district coordinators, because we would like to talk about that across all of our permitting programs. Really help make that a reality, and also at the same time speeding up our processes so that they don't get bogged down with people not getting the help that they need in direction that used to be available. So this is not the old board versus board debate. What we're looking for is what are all the good parts of the systems and how can we maximize and utilize those. So any input would be greatly appreciated.
All right, I'm Sarah Hatt. I'm from Franklin County, Salvins more specifically. And if you're wondering what was wrong with the weather this weekend, it was Maple Festival, because we start with the really nice weather, then snow and rain, and now we're back to nice weather now that it's done. And I'm thrilled to be in the Word. I had a career as a municipal planner for many years, and then most recently was a town manager. I have had some experience in floodplain and floodplain manager. And in my previous municipal work, we were also delegating community rule 1 of 2 for on-site wastewater from the state of Vermont for permitting, and also took over shoreline regs. And so it's great municipal planning. You have that sort of diverse background of sort of jack of all trades and learning things. And I love to learn things, and particularly about planning. And I think this has been just such an honor to be on this board with all the incredible people that just went before me in terms of their explanations. I chose the challenge of the Tier 1A, which is going to be the exempt areas for towns that choose to apply. So there's the Tier 1A, Tier 1B, and the Tier 1A guidance in terms of what are you going to need to apply. So after regional planning plans are approved, anticipating after the first of the year, municipalities coming in and applying for Tier 1A status. I'm also working with Kirsten on the road rule and Tier 2, and have been sort of helping out with all the different regional plans and what have you. Want to get stood up in a short period of time. It's all very exciting and challenging work. Happy to listen on any other projects too. And I think with road rule and Tier 2, those are things we haven't yet begun, but we'll be looking to start once we have some of the other earlier deadlines.
Okay, so now you know everything about what we're doing. You have no questions because it was all super clear. No, that's not true. So this is our time to be in conversation with you about what you'd like to know more about, or if you're really brave, what you think about our own program, Act 250 as a whole, and what you might like to convey to us about the program, realizing that with the exception of Kirsten and really Brooke, Sarah, Jana, and I are relative newbies to the Act 250 program, having experienced it from the outside, but not been deeply immersed in it. And I, for one, would be happy to hear a story or a critique or an endorsement about the program that all of you have been a part of. But only if you're brave. Otherwise, you can just ask us questions and we can talk about that too.
I'll be brave. I'm Don Marsh. I'm a retired civil engineer. I've only been working with Act 250 since 1974. We've done tens of projects throughout all the districts. So I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. I say really good. I think that's where we are. I've had this discussion with Brooke. My suggestion is that we amend the statute to remove criteria 1 through 5, as there's issues are addressed by agency, natural resources, and agency transportation permits. And it does a number of things. It allows the applicant to, if they choose, to defer some of the expenses of the technical permits and address the real planning issues. The other issue is it takes the blame away from Act 250 for being the delays in the project. So we can actually issue a permit and say, okay, you need these other permits, you can't build without them anyway. But Act 250 could issue the permit in, 2 or 3 months, which can happen. As opposed to waiting, we had one recently, it was, I think it was 16 months before an agency permit was issued, and then that Act 250 got issued. Whereas it could have been issued way before. So I think that's an improvement that will not diminish any of the importance of Act 250, but make the process a little easier.
That was brave. I haven't heard anything quite that, significant in terms of suggestions in any of these meetings that we've had around the state so far. And I'll be honest with you, Don, before I joined the board, before I even knew there was gonna be a board, was watching Act 181 go through its iterations. And even all the way back to the commission on Act 250, the future of Act 250. That was one of my thoughts, was like, we've got these 10 criteria, 32 sub-criteria, and they haven't changed a lot, in the 50 years. And I wonder if we could get rid of some and maybe add some new ones that speak to the issues of today and the future. And that didn't really happen, with the exception of criterion 8C. We didn't really see a whole lot of change to the criteria themselves. So interesting idea.
Along with that, apologies for my chair, is that we couldn't find projects without those A&R 2030. So the Act 250 permit gets circulated in rapidly. The list would be outstanding with A&R permits. Once those permits are issued, we implement on question the public law. So I don't know if Pacific Bank can eliminate those state permits are required anyway. And nobody can commence the project without them. You still have an Act 250 permit, you still have to wait and pay for one level.
But if the statutes were changed and our rules, along the line of what Donna's saying, the Act 250 permit could in fact be issued ahead of those permits with conditions that they be obtained, as opposed to the Act 250 permit being the last one to be issued after everything else is finalized, even if it happens quickly at the very end.
I think it shifts the blame to where it belongs, to delays of permits, like is the advantage. I mean, you can have that 250. I mean, granted, you need all the other permits, but why should we get blamed for a year-long delay for water supply permit? And if they don't get it, that's their problem. Let's be a land use statute and stick with that, do it well, and not get muddy with these other issues.
And we have heard that at the other regional meetings, right? That
Yeah.
people feel like Act 250 has a reputation problem. And that part of it is not, not our fault, because, they're related, the delay issue is related to A&R permits that can take a very long time, whether it's water supply or stormwater or whatever.
It's similar to, when municipal permits get issued. A DRB might not have jurisdiction over the wastewater, but it still needs to get that permit before that construction can occur. And a DRB would put conditions in their decision that says you need that, you need that permit before commencing any construction. But the other thing is that it's a brave idea, and it's an idea that this board this year can't really do anything with. We have our hands full with implementing Act 181 for the next year or two at least. And at some point, we're going to be going back to the legislature with a report. I think it's 2029. And, that far out, if nobody has decided that that's a great idea in the legislature and already done it, we could probably think about it more seriously and make a recommendation.
Yes, I see it. There's kind of two issues that need to be explored. One is the alignment of an A&R permit to the actual criterion that, often it's a presumption, access of rebuttable presumption, but they are not always in concert with one another. The other issue is for those, even for those that are, question is one of notice and participation. Neighbors, I mean, within A&R permitted, have folks been given the opportunity to know about and participate in something that would, create some undue adverse impact. So it sounds like a very intriguing idea. But it does require some study. I mean, I agree with Janet, we just can't focus on our attention right now on that.
It
But-
clearly would take adjustments in agency permits in terms of
Right,
notification.
right.
But that's can be done.
And I think your appeals work will sort of address this to some degree. In looking at the relationship between the different A&R permits, the municipal permit and the Act 250 permit. And could be, could set the stage for more thinking about it after we issue that report. Sorry, Ed, go ahead.
Just a process question. I noticed public speak later on the agenda. Are we able to
Sure,
participate in this
yes,
dialogue?
Yes, go ahead.
Group discussion, everyone.
Yeah.
So besides being the shy guy from Barry, I worked for Act 250, 32 years. I administered District 5, Washington, Monroe County, total of 35 towns. I've known Don for all those years. So a little bit of point counterpoint. The difficulty with the elimination of criteria 1 through 3 at least is it has to be balanced with the supervisory role of district commissions, which have been part of Act 250 since the beginning. And that supervisory function was recognized and confirmed by the Vermont Supreme Court in its Mountain decision. It's a function which is extremely rarely exercised. In my entire 32-year career, it was only substantively exercised a dozen times. I processed, without tooting my horns, hundreds, if not 1,000 applications over those years. And that supervisory function was only exercised about a dozen times. But I can tell you, those times worked their weight in gold in public input in terms of that oversight function of whether or not the agency crossed T's and dotted I's. So I can go on at length about that, but I won't. So I'm just talking about balancing that very important supervisory role. A second comment is the marked difference between public's opportunity to participate in an agency process versus public participation in Act 250. Those of us that have been to agency public meetings on a draft permit, it's a public meeting. We are allowed to comment, but sometimes I've been in meetings which are a little bit out of the page of Franz Kafka, where the agency does not even respond to the public making those comments. Simply, comments are noted, and then maybe 5 or 6 months subsequent to that, in the response to the summary comment, you get a response. So again, there's a big difference between participation in an agency public meeting and obtaining party status. Of course, you have to demonstrate particularized interest participating in party in Act 250. And finally, the infamous Act 250 delay. A book could be written about the causes of delays in Act 250. I won't bog you down with that right now, but it is a topic worth drilling down into. Delays caused by waiting for agency permits, yes. Delays caused by applicants, very true. I mean, I could document cases where we waited 12 to 14 months to get responses from applicants, completely skewing the statistics for the district commission. Whose fault was that? So delay is a huge topic to see what are the actual causes of delays. But I wanted to comment primarily on we're going to think twice about eliminating those criteria. Both of you wanted to new chair of the District 5 Commission.
Kevin, go ahead.
Sure. So Kevin Anderson, I'm a district coordinator. I've been here for about 2.5 years, and I'm in this limited service role where I kind of rove in the northern districts. And I would say most of my work thus far has been in District 5. And so just for your general awareness, I would say it's a busy district. We don't, in our annual report, like break out permit activity by district, although I'm sure we could give you those numbers. And my sense is that it is a very busy district. And that applicants, because of the sort of my limited service role and this extra grant funding we received, we're very appreciative of having a second coordinator in that district. I think it's been the case historically, and Susan or Mr. Stagg may be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there have been two coordinators serving District 5, either a single coordinator and assistant or two for many years. And it wasn't until maybe 8 or 9 years ago when one left staff and we went down to one. So just a general comment on staffing levels, and it might relate to some of the time involved in issuing permits that Mr. Stagg brought up. And then the other comment, Hagen mentioned the criterion 8C rulemaking, which relates to forest blocks and habitat connectors we looked at later this summer. There is there's an organized effort around protecting what's known as the Schuylsville Wildlife Corridor, which is on the Stowe and Waterbury town line. And there have been, starting in like 2017, some interesting cases related to the connectivity values of that corridor. I think the first was at the then Public Service Board and related to the cell tower. And then there were a couple of other Act 250 applications that the commission saw related to residential and commercial development in that corridor. And so it may be worth, and I'd be happy to provide the information on these cases, just kind of like looking at those cases to see how those issues were considered by commissions. And you might even consider applying some of your thinking on 8C kind of retrospectively to those cases to see how they would sort out. So just let me know if you're interested in learning more about those particular cases. There are many other wildlife corridors around the state that people are trying to protect, but I know those, the Schuylsville one in particular, did receive a lot of attention, some of the press, and does have a fairly organized kind of community presence around.
That's a really good suggestion. I like the idea of looking at the new criterion and the rules for it, and in the context of actual cases, that maybe went through without that criterion being there. And it's great that you bring up Schuylsville, because I wasn't very aware of it until our Tier 3 working group meeting last week, when I think Seth, sitting next to you, brought it up as like potentially the example of a habitat connector that might be a good candidate for a Tier 3 designation. And then looking at it afterwards, it was interesting to see, what's trying to be cobbled together between the Green Mountains and the Worcester Range to make that happen. So thanks, Kevin. That's great.
I'll just jump in for a minute and say, well, Act 250 can do what it can to deal with the habitat connector issue. We have no jurisdiction over the siting of towers, which was the issue, which thankfully the tower was denied. So it seemed as if it would have been okay, but it would have been okay to sort of the outskirts of the corridor. So in terms of our approach to this, and also knowing that we're doing regional town planning, I think it's really important for planning entities to understand the limitations that we have in Act 250 to control siting of energy projects, towers, because there is, while there are some Act 250 criterion that are incorporated into that process, not all of them are. And they also, the Public Utility Commission also has what's been referred to as a trump card in terms of if there's an undue adverse impact on a criterion, they can say, but it's okay because the public interest requires that we put a tower up in this location. And so you can end up where we would deny a permit in Act 250 for an undue adverse impact. They have a different standard of review, that they have this other consideration that can override the finding of undue adverse impact. So it's important to understand that holistically, particularly in something like habitat connectors, which are really important.
These are very heady comments, so, which I think are great, but we're also happy to take, you know, off the cuff comments about life in District 5 and, you know, how it's been working or not.
Well, I'll just add that there used to be a moose that would cross, Route 100 at Churchill Hill back and forth, and I always thought it knew old school.
Never argue with a moose when crossing a road, right?
Board thoughts? For Central Vermont in particular?
Well, actually, I'm curious to follow up on Kevin's point, since Ed's in the room and Susan's in the room, like, what was it a 2 coordinator district back in the day? And what was that like? Three?
For just
Two and
one
a half.
district?
Three big areas. Or a lot more, back then, more projects required activity review than they do now.
Gotcha.
The small, 10 to 5,000 plus is really impact. But it's too much to do for one person. There's, in addition to the applications that come in, there's a lot of email questions, phone call questions. All of the new regulations require questions, there's more interest from whether or not it requires a permit. The applicant permit specialist is the on to the coordinator, in the jurisdictional reviews, which takes forever now because of.
Yeah.
So, you can try and.
Not sure everybody can hear you in the back. Could you speak just a little bit?
Oh, sorry, yeah. I would just say that it's burdensome for one person to do this because of the numerous changes in the law that have reduced jurisdiction, but there's still now changes where more and more people have questions about things.
Yep.
And so it's hard to balance doing the application, which take priority, answering questions, because sometimes that question can take you a day to research. And then everything else is still.
Yeah.
So
And-
it's really frustrating. It frustrates the consultant. You have to prioritize and make hourly to get things done. So it's just not a lot. So, well, I congratulate Kevin and Jane, you definitely. I've alone selfishly for myself, that I've lost. So I would just add, staffing is problematic. Using work share and permanent response to staff shortages is not good. Work share works for someone being on leave or out of medical, something like that, but it's a permanent solution. We've tried this for 4 or 5 years, and it fails.
So district coordinator staffing has been our #1 priority with the legislature this session. And we did get pretty good news out of the Senate last week. So stay tuned. You know, we were a little despondent before the crossover from what came out of the House, but it looks like we're in much better position now to maintain at least 9.
Because usually anytime anyone retires, gets promoted, that position is figured. Now, I guess if the ARPA funding was temporary. But I really don't want to lose Lynn.
Right.
From the final state. Be nice to replace at least Kevin. It's gonna be full time with me. At least that person.
You know, I think ideally we would have, well, maybe ideally we would have more than 9 coordinators, but we have 9 districts. Let's have 9 coordinators. But the other thing that came up in, you know, maybe most of these meetings that we've had is that the loss of the permit specialist at A&R really created more work for our district coordinators and our district
Kind of
technicians. So,
breathtaking, you know.
yeah,
I don't think it was understood how these substance contributors
right.
powerful. And for most of the work for agencies as well. Because they become the expert of what source the permits project requires. And the form is to be just two-sided, and it has lists up to date, of all the contact info, and we check off the wetlands or the.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was all in one sheet of paper. Now you get a day of yours truly, but it doesn't tell you what other food you need.
Right,
And I might mention that as a courtesy, but
right.
so it's really taken away the efficiency that it was allegedly.
And as Brooke reported in her first stakeholder group discussion that got talked about, and this idea of having an ombuds person help people through all the permitting processes, you know, maybe we can get it back. Not imminently, but maybe,
District 5.
maybe even better.
Permit specialist is now the coordinator. So I
Yeah.
still haven't asked him a question. We still have to do like, you can remember something like whether or not somebody had a permit.
And it is hard to hear, Susan, but what she just said is one of the old permit specialists is now a coordinator and is a resource to our other coordinators, obviously, in terms of other state permits. So,
And I see Ed's got commentary I want to hear, but I just want to say, Susan, I feel your pain in that, in my prior role in the municipal office, it was remarkable how much time each day was spent just answering questions and doing the research necessary in the municipal files to be able to answer those questions. And it always felt, to me, it always felt like it was my obligation to provide a reasonable response in a reasonable time frame. But that's not that was never part of my to-do list for the day. And so I definitely hear what you're saying. And if the permit specialist going away created that many more phone calls to your office to answer questions about any permit and research into old permits, I take your point.
Well, yeah, and Susan, I just want you to know too, and for those who don't know, I served until recently as the coordinator for District 7, which is the Northeast Kingdom region, and I was in that role for about 19 years. And so please know that I bring that deep understanding of the needs of what happens in the regional offices and what is currently happening to the board. And you know, what the roving coordinator assignment is a little bit different than the coordinator who's assigned. And yes, I remember there were 2.5 coordinators in D5 and there were 2.5 in D7. And we've had this shift of sorts. And of course, now with the board's arrival, it's a different staffing assignments. And we are still going to be continuing some conversations around all of this as we continue to figure out how we're doing our work. And alongside supporting, you know, the regional offices for me, like this is like the front line of our program administration. It's so essential. And so we absolutely need to make sure that they're appropriately resourced.
Here.
yeah, and
Just wanted to add to what Susan said. The advent of at least 2 coordinates in District 5 happened under the Governor Cooney administration. Under Governor Cooney, there was a real push for one-stop shopping. She had a goal to make the process very user-friendly. That was the era in which the project review sheet was created, to be able to provide the public with a quick answer: do I need to get a permit? Check it right off. We used to do scads of those. And that also led into the creation of the position of the permit specialist. So the standing love, the idea of one-stop shopping originally was that the technical staff from A&R, stormwater permitting and wetlands, would actually be based out in regional offices to decentralize the process as much as possible. As time went on, it swung in the other direction, where offices were closed. Our office, or the District 5 office, was consolidated with the NRB office in order to save rent, which always drove me crazy because the state was paying itself rent. So it was being moving from one column to the other to the detriment of public service. But one other comment on the need for district coordinators. It was true that there was a substantial number of 1-acre towns at a certain point in time. And the district commission was inclined, since there was no zoning board review, the district commission therefore is inclined to schedule a hearing for projects in 1 acre towns to provide a forum for the public to see what was going on, just to provide that role, otherwise provided by a zoning board. And another comment is, the district commission used to apply a very conservative interpretation of Rule 51, which is the rule for minor applications. So the district commission always had a conservative approach. If the application really qualifies as minor under the terms of that rule, this resulted in a significant number of hearings because the commission didn't think they qualified as minors. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm sort of like my eyebrows have been raised over the years. I look at the annual reports that are required by the General Assembly and the increasing number of applications over the years processed as minors. You need staff, you're going to have hearings. So anyway, I just wanted to reinforce what Susan said. It began with Governor Coonan. It was driven both by workload, but also the interpretation of Rule 51 and the number of 1 acre towns in District 5.
Yeah, just want to flag Aaron has to say something.
Oh, Aaron, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as state coordinator, I would be remiss if I didn't also point out for historical context that when I started 12 years ago, there were 2 coordinators in District 2. And there were also 2 coordinators in Rutland. So a separate coordinator for District 8 and District 1. In addition to the 2 in Chittenden County and the 2 in District 5.
Yep. And now if you don't count the 2 ARPA funded, we have 7. So. Pete, what is the Senate offering us?
So the current,
Can you please speak up, because Rebecca's taking notes and it's been hard to hear folks when they're speaking from the back.
sure, so the current Senate budget has us in for 2 permanent classified positions.
Yes. And those are coordinator. So. Any more? Oh, go ahead, Bill.
Your comment is not related to that.
It's okay.
Talk to Susan Kevin about this, maybe other people, but the interim exemptions for priority housing projects, you're only gonna be around for 4 years, so maybe limited the possibility of getting this. All the other interim exemptions include floodplain and super corridors from the exempt areas and the priority housing projects. And I mean, that seems like those are the worst kind. I mean, it's like unlimited units, mixed income housing, limited people who are less able to bounce back. Their new house gets flooded. And maybe this will be basically I'm trying to just anyone who can maybe remedy this, trying to just raise awareness. But I've seen this problem. But that seems like a problem, and yes, this was not on purpose in Act 181. The interim exemption for priority housing projects starting and then there were expanded in Act 181, and then I think like 11, 12 pages later in Act 181, they introduced all the new exemptions. And you can even see they have the track changes version. The excluding the floodplain river work there was added in after the rest of the new exemptions. My guess is probably people thought all this up while they're drafting the bill and like, oh, well, we should exclude the floodplain river, of course. And went in all the new exemptions and instead excluding the floodplain river, and just probably because it's 11 pages earlier in the bill, probably just didn't add that language to the priority housing project. Modified priority housing project exemption in Act 181. So that's speculation, but regardless of what the extension was, it seems like a problem. And I don't know, maybe that's not really what's our responsible for remedying.
No, certainly not. That's legislative remedy. But, and as I said, we made a decision in our first meeting not to focus on lobbying the legislature to make policy changes. because we felt like our primary responsibility this year was to implement Act 181. But so, in terms of the interim exemptions and floodplains, there is infill is allowed. And I can't remember the language of priority housing projects. Is there no mention of river corridor? In those examples, there's not.
I remember it being an awkward or odd absence as well, but I don't remember exactly what it says,
Yeah.
but we can look into it. But like Janet said, this year, we're not in this board anyways, is not in the business of telling the legislature, fix this, this, and this.
Except that we want coordinators.
Right. Next year might be different.
Yeah.
We might have capacity to actually start telling them where they maybe could have done a better job with Act 181 and how to remedy it.
So the one thing that I'll bring up too is an odd juxtaposition of bill changes that came out at the same time. You had Act 181 and Act 121.
Right.
Which pertains to all things rivers and floodways. And over the next few years, ANR is going to be working on how that is going to be applied statewide in terms of like bare minimum per counts. And so I think we're trying to push the ball ahead on all the things that we're supposed to be working on and recognizing that there's a whole sea change, quite literally, that's happening over here and how we intertwine it. So I would like to take more of an optimistic viewpoint on that there are people sort of working on that already and will be working on it. So I think the thing is just to sort of keep that broad picture approach as we move forward and be cognizant of what other people are trying to do as well. And hopefully we'll push everything until very much.
So we have a couple more minutes before moving on to our RPC presentation. Susan.
Find out if, Susan, you really gotta speak up. I'm sorry, the people online are having a really hard time hearing folks in the back, so if you can just please speak up, that would be appreciated. Yeah, thanks.
I'm just wondering how, Act 250 is involving joining landowner with notice. Is that going to be a component in any of the tier studies where adjoining landowners will have in other words, the application will have a place to put address and name of adjoining landowners, so then going to be notice about these projects.
So Susan's asking whether the tier rulemaking might accommodate notice to abutters or adjoining landowners. Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm just restating it because it is hard to hear, Susan. And it's not just Susan, but there's loud HVAC in this room too. So, and I mean, that's certainly something that we can talk about at our.
Well, to be clear, with regard to the rulemaking process for tier 3, that we have a specified sort of legal process that we have to go through with a working group and the general public and formal public hearings. It is not the case that we will be are required to, or probably be able to notify every single landowner who might have property in a proposed tier 3 area.
So I mean,
yeah, that's
people think actually these property boundaries are shared with project trust.
Right. So if a property ends up being in tier 3 and it triggers Act 250, then yes, the same notification.
So on tier
Same.
1A, that will be where a municipality can come in and say that they have a robust enough system that meets the statutory requirements to sort of administer some of the things through their local process. They still have to have a local process, which under 24 BSA requires that butter notification too. So that should not, there should still be a robust property notification through that municipal system as opposed to the state system. With tier 1B.
Well, it's the same. So when Act 250 is triggered, the current Act 250 protocol would be used. And when it's not, it it still needs that municipal zoning permit. And Title 24, Chapter 117 requires notice to abutters for permits that need a public hearing. If it's an administrative permit, all that needs to happen is they need to post the site with a zoning permit sign. And somebody that lives near it could call the zoning administrator and say, what's going on there? But, you know, for larger projects, they're probably going to be going to a DRB and there will be public hearing and it will be noticed.
Yeah, I think we
So-
found that the tier 1B areas still have to have, correct me if I'm wrong, adopted zoning and subdivision regulations
Yes.
at the municipal level. So I think our feeling is that, yes, even in a tier 1A or B that might have some level of exemption, partial or complete, we would expect that there would be notice to abutters through the municipal development review process.
Do you ensure that that's part of the process? Or is that?
It's law. So the zoning, yeah,
And I think it what's the requirements from Act 1A1 give us is, I think with both tier 1A and B, there's a requirement that you have to have adequate staffing, which really speaks to how you carry out some of these legally required things. So I think that gives us some room to make sure that these things are followed. And there's also check-ins and they can be as few as 4 years. They can be more frequent too with municipalities.
and that will be at the LURB's discretion.
Yeah.
And we need to give our RPCs their time on our agenda. We're 1 minute over. Do you have something?
Oh,
Kirsten,
real
that-
quick, the boards were going to be working on a community engagement plan as well for general engagement.
So who's first? Central Vermont is listed first on our agenda. So we start with Central?
Up to you guys.
Either way is fine.
Well, let's start with Central.
Okay.
It's alphabetical.
Yeah, that too.
That is important. We wait until our HVAC crew is ready or?
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That probably set off an alarm in a different building. so,
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Fair enough, yeah.
So we're all freezing.
It is not warm in here. All right, well, thanks all. Again, I'm Brian Boyd, Senior Planner and Program Manager at the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission. Christian, our Executive Director, was double or triple booked for this time, so unfortunately, Creedy get me instead. And I'm joined with the rest of our community development team here. So as I understood it, you were asked to prepare a few remarks about sort of the status of the regional plan and the future land use map, and to highlight some challenges, hopefully successes and challenges.
Yeah.
I think we've had several of both. So in terms of the adoption timeline, we're in the thick of it right now and working on the plan, working on the future land use map, and I really hope to wrap up the draft of all of that work in the fall of this year, move into public hearings in the winter through early spring, implement revisions in the spring of 2026, CVRPC board adoption hopefully by late spring or summer of that year, and then moving into the materials over to the land use review board for summer, fall of 2026. I don't know where that gets us on your one plan per month, but probably.
So, so your 60-day before you have a hearing, you would submit to us, and that's where we start the clock. And so you're thinking when for the 60-day pre-application?
in the fall of this.
So gotta duke it out with the other three.
Did you say fall of 2026?
No, they're saying this year. So NVDA, CCRPC, you guys, and one other who I'm getting at the moment.
No,
No, it's not Lemoyne.
Rutland.
Oh, it's Rutland, yeah. So, I mean, we just wouldn't have the capacity to take all four of them at once. Especially for the first go round. So hopefully you guys can talk amongst each other and pick, each of you pick a month for that 60-day pre-app. You know, maybe next year this will be more routine and we can do that, but anyway, talk about it first.
That's fine.
Okay.
In terms of the regional plan draft, we are near final draft for our natural systems, economy and working lands, transportation chapters, and have some relatively rougher drafts of our infrastructure, energy, land use, and housing chapters. And one other thing I'll note about the regional plan, and this is where we haven't formally engaged yet, is that we're also we've identified a few threads that we want to weave throughout all of the chapters in the documents, focused on affordability, aging demographics, and climate change and extreme weather resilience. I think initially folks were really talking about flooding. There's been a lot of focus on flooding and how much of our regional plan we should spend talking about flooding. Really pushing to expand that beyond flooding, because although flood seems to get the most noteworthiness in the news, we are really facing multiple different challenges related to weather as we move into the future. We have a stakeholder survey that is out right now. That's we received about 115 responses, representing 19 of our 23 municipalities. That will be open for another couple of weeks. Have not really seen any surprising outcomes from the initial survey responses. Just really happy to be getting a broad number of responses across all age groups and employment statuses. And if we can just work on a little bit more messaging to those municipalities where we haven't received responses, and we can try.
And is this a sort of asking them what they want to see in the new plan, or?
Yes, it's really focused on what folks want to see in terms of future development.
Okay.
So what they want to see, where they want to see it, and what are their concerns about either too much development or not enough development, or some combination.
Yeah. Do you expect that to inform the future land use map?
Yeah, so that's really going to help drive some of the decisions, sort of the sticking points in the future land use map, particularly as it relates to feedback on the locations where people want to see new development. And so we split that out into residential, commercial, and industrial. And again, not surprisingly, people want to see our residential and commercial activities really in our village centers and already dense areas, and we're a bit more open to industrial development in the proximity of interstate interchanges, for example. So not a ton of surprising information there, but definitely affirmation for the direction that the map and the plan were part of. On top of that, Nikki has been out in multiple communities.
I've been doing public outreach and informal tabling sessions around the region at our public libraries. I've worked with some of the library directors and planned different times to table based on the most traffic. So I've reached, it's ebbs and flows, but it's been pretty good with quality information from a lot of residents who have grown up. a lot of volunteers, mainly PC members and conservation commission members, as well as, parents have been pretty involved in the conversation. So, I think big items that I heard, emphasis on the waterways in our land use planning for central Vermont. Rethinking development review board standards and energy planning in the early stages of neighborhood development. As well as public transit opportunities for rural towns to our. To the main item.
Those are sort of, the companion pieces to our outreach and stakeholder, input solicitation. In terms of the future land use map, first we're working hard here to apply the VAPTA methodology. I can say that, as it relates to the rural conservation, the rural ag and forestry categories, we're really taking more of a regional perspective on what those blocks might look at. And that for the centers and neighborhoods, it's more of a localized perspective. And that where we're really, I think going to be spending the bulk of our time are in these areas that fall in between. And do they get pushed further out into the rural category? Does it make more sense to bring those into the transition infill enterprise categories? And so I think that's really going to be where we spend quite a bit of time in the coming weeks, is sort of refining those boundaries between that sort of rural conservation and the more areas in our village centers and our towns.
Do you feel that the methodology addresses that adequately? Is it helping you make those determinations in any way?
I think it presents the factors that we should be considering in making those determinations. I don't think it was ever intended to tell us exactly where to put lines on.
Right.
But I think that it provides a unifying framework for all of the regional planning commissions to apply, but that, as we all know, that water planning is still the local here. And to me, it's trying to integrate this regional perspective for that rural conservation, the rural ag and forestry, and taking that step back, because it's really the space where you need to identify the larger blocks of land, and then using the methodology to help us make those decisions for those intermediate areas and where they best fit in a more unified way for the rest of the regional planning commissions. So we're, as part of the future land use mapping work as it relates to our housing targets, allocating our housing targets, we're doing a sort of a light suitability analysis to look at both biophysical and ecological constraints. So of those areas that we might consider steering development, are there any other obvious conflicts that might pop up, as well as taking a harder look at things like municipal zoning and future land use maps from the municipalities to make sure that we, to the extent possible, can get some alignment there. We've got, although not confirmed, we've initiated conversation with our municipalities on their plans related to Tier 1A and Tier 1B status. At least preliminarily, it seems like we maybe have 3 municipalities that will pursue Tier 1A and 7 municipalities that will pursue Tier 1B. And I'll note that there's overlap in that list. All 3 of the Tier 1As will likely go for Tier 1B in the short term. Challenges that we've faced. One of the big challenges is really about data, and in particular, data on utilities. So water system more so than wastewater, but just accessing available data to help define the boundaries of the centers and the neighborhoods has been somewhat of a challenge. We've had to reproduce data from old static maps, for example, to help make better decisions about where these boundaries should be for our likely to be denser development areas. In addition to that, really the lack of information about the system capacity to be able to absorb new development or the potential for system expansion really leaves us sort of playing a bit of a guessing game as far as that's concerned. So developing additional data resources somewhat outside of the RPC mandate, but doing that to the extent that we can make informed decisions about the way that we're designating these zones. But I think it's something that's worth looking at from a statewide perspective as the program here matures and folks look to refine boundaries in the future.
So are you comfortable disclosing which are the 3 municipalities that you anticipate will be pursuing Tier 1A? And it had, Jen, when you were out of the room, it's also made known that it was expected that there would additionally be 7 Tier 1B. Are you?
I'm comfortable with just about anything, but I will say that these have not been confirmed.
Sure.
That we've had conversations and no one's signing an ink. 1A, Berlin, Montpelier, and Northfield. 1B, Berry City, Berry Town, Waitsfield, Waterbury, and the 3 1A towns. So again, Berlin, Montpelier.
Thank you.
And I think just to clarify too, you said about capacity guessing game. I guess this would be specifically with water and wastewater infrastructure. And
Yeah, in terms of being able to define reasonable boundaries for the centers and the neighborhoods based on the ability of an existing system to absorb additional development. So if one of the criteria is that the area is served by water and wastewater, and there's no additional capacity in the system, then what are we really doing with the definition of a zone there? So just
Might there be plans for increasing capacity?
I mean, there's a lot of great plans for doing that and not a lot of piles of money to do
Right,
so. So it
right.
depends on the time horizon over which you're
Right.
considering that. But I'm just thinking more as we're trying to establish these zone boundaries now, not knowing if a water system, for example, is 90% subscribed or 50% subscribed. If it's 90% subscribed, is there even enough water for system expansion? So, I mean, that I think is valuable information to know in making the map. And I think it's unrealistic that we will develop that depth of information to
Right.
draw these boundaries through.
And I don't know that, I'm not, certainly the methodology doesn't ask you to do that at this point. It
does not.
It says to make some sort of judgment call about how far away from the end of the line you want to extend service in terms of drawing the boundaries.
But if we have a mismatch between when development occurs and when infrastructure investments occur, I think that will present us with more problems than solution that relates to the housing crisis or just land use planning.
How many of the communities that have municipal water and wastewater, one, the other, both, have that level of question about their capacity? Are they all like that? Are they all over the map, or is it just a couple of anomalies?
In terms of the level of detail that they have, or?
Yeah, you said there are questions about how much capacity they actually have to serve future development. That makes it, to me, that makes it sound like there's at least one municipality that doesn't know what they're currently serving and doesn't know what they could serve in the future. Is that the normal case for your communities, or is that unusual?
I mean, I'm not sure. I'm just saying it's not easily accessible information. And so what we're finding is that we're reaching out to our communities, and sometimes they have, a volunteer water board. And then it's, well, what do their records look like? Is the right person in town, or because they're retired on the other side of the world for the next 6 months? These are the situations that we're facing. I'm I'm advocating more for a state role in centralized information collection so that it can actually support these planning activities. Again, if the criteria says certify water or wastewater, and that's all we need to check, I would argue that we're not doing enough to make sure that those boundaries should be where we think they should be. And I think guesswork on some level is always going to come into play because there's a lot of different balls in the air when you're trying to establish where the boundaries are. But to the extent that the state could play a role in providing this data, it would certainly make for more compelling boundaries that going forward.
Yeah,
I was gonna say, I think A and R should be able to help with some of that through the different permits that those communities have. And the reporting requirements that they have. So that data does exist within A and R. I think just the general thing that I think I hear you trying to articulate is lack of infrastructure planning. And it's a different animal than land use planning. And it's something that a lot of communities, I think, are challenged with in terms of trying to figure out, planning for the future on the infrastructure side and, that sort of scalability that you're speaking to in terms of who are you going to serve, what area you're going to serve, and how you're going to plan the finance. I see that as something that I think the legislature is talking about, the financing pieces of it. And I think that there is some emphasis being added to that, so let's hope that that continues. But understood that is sort of own unique animal amongst planning animals, and is perhaps an area that was sort of left aside with all the other prioritizations that we have, but is very important to what actually is good.
Because I think what Act 181 focused on was making those boundaries such that they could support the amount of housing, certainly, that the Home Act asks everybody to accommodate. So there's that judgment call that Act 181 asks you to make in terms of drawing those center and neighborhood boundaries such that they could accommodate what the statewide housing goals are each municipality.
And Brian, I was asking the question because in my previous role as a municipal official, I would talk to A&R about the town of Heinsberg's municipal water and sewer capacities. And I was floored when my contact there told me, oh, you guys actually know or think you know what you have for capacities. That's not the case throughout much of Vermont. There are a lot of municipalities that have public water systems and have no idea what their actual, full capacity would be and therefore what they have left. And I was just like, what? How is that even possible? And he said, trust me, it's possible. And so I wanted to ask you directly, because you're working with a smaller group of towns, and it sounds like you've had a little bit of the same experience, depending on the municipality. Yeah, I don't disagree with you that there might be, that might be a good story to tell a legislator to help create a more of a statewide resource to solve that challenge. But I also think that RPCs maybe have a role to play in helping those municipalities do what Sarah's talking about, which is infrastructure planning. The state is there to maybe help with funding of new capacity or retrofits, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us, including the RPCs, to help the municipalities that don't have that information figure it out. It doesn't seem like it should be that difficult.
I think it is so complicated because there are so many different issues like, infiltration during rain events and the age of pipes. And a lot of municipalities have over allocated for decades and they don't even know how much allocation there could be left. And they need to grab some of that allocation back. And, there are a lot of questions and A&R won't answer them for you. They don't have the capacity to figure it out for every town in the state that has those kinds of questions. I think they'll tell you that.
But they would like them considered. That's what they told us, is that they think that that's a issue.
Record keeping on its face is not a difficult thing. Retroactive record keeping.
Right.
People weren't even thinking about the things to keep records on 30 years
years
later
ago.
makes it challenging. And so I don't have a solution. I'm certainly not trying to pass the buck and say the state should do this. I agree that the regional planning commissions have a role. I'm just thinking about, given the time horizon under which we're operating, the level of detail that I think would be nice to actually set these boundaries with the best of intention is not achievable. And instead, we'll do the best we can, and there will be some guesswork around the edges. I just note that that's a challenge to the process and may lead to unintended consequences as it relates to future development.
Yeah, and I do think that it's at this point, because we have limited time and don't have as good a data as we'd like, it's the intent and in the statute that matters most. And if, I don't want to, I'm not speaking for the board, but just as one planner, you know, if there's a community that clearly has a reasonable center that you want to map, but has questionable infrastructure to support that in terms of future development, it doesn't make sense in my mind for that center to just not exist because the infrastructure isn't planned for future development. It still makes sense to me that the center would exist, but maybe we need to do more handholding and support and financial and infrastructure planning to help them take the next step for improvements, rather than deny them the whole concept that Act 181 is built on, which is that there are supposed to be centers.
Right, and I just want to be really clear, we're not looking to disappear any state designated areas. It's more whether we're comfortable expanding those boundaries to capture some of the benefits of the program beyond the existing centers. And that's really where my issue with the lack of infrastructure data.
Yeah. But we all recognize that the village center designations were never designed to be what this act is talking about in terms of centers. And so expanding a village center designation in a community that has water and sewer makes total sense to me as one person, one board member. Even if the water and sewer infrastructure is going to be coming along later for the ride, because we're not sure of the capacities of it. Because those village center designations were historic commercial areas, right? They were never intended to support residential growth.
Right. But the other thing that Act 181 intends is for every municipality to have a center. And you don't have to have zoning. You don't have to have any infrastructure. You do have to show that there are some soils that could support wastewater treatment. And so, you know, there's a tier of, you know, how much little teeny rural towns all the way to our cities and everything in between. And I think the questions are going to be different at each level. So 2 more minutes for you guys.
2 more minutes.
Okay.
Three quick challenges.
Okay.
Flood hazard data. We're just stuck in Central Vermont, playing a waiting game with FEMA. I've heard that the maps got moved from the USGS to FEMA. Anyway, nobody needs to cry with me on this whole issue, but it really does limit, put some other limitations on our ability to plan. My understanding is some of these zones may change somewhat significantly. It's not necessarily going to impact the relationship between flood hazard zones and our village centers. We already know about all the problems there. I'm once again just thinking about these expanding out beyond these existing centers and wanting to make sure that the way we plan for or site new development doesn't push things into a yet to be disclosed flood hazard area. Nothing that you all can, I don't know, can you all speed up FEMA?
FEMA might not even exist.
Yeah, fair enough. Thinking about the town of Plainfield in particular as it relates to this. So identifying new areas for dense development. So as you all probably know, Plainfield was impacted the last 2 summers by floods. They've been looking at potentially developing or trying to designate a new area out of their existing center. And so making sure there's a mechanism somewhere in this planning process for towns that really want to make that huge leap of we've done flood impacts for too many years in a row. We need to think about, relocation.
What was that? Yeah, I missed
I
that.
was just saying Berry City would probably fall in the lines of looking to other areas like.
Yeah, I mean, Berry City's so constrained, it's a little bit different than Plainfield, where Plainfield's actually saying, like, it'd be nice if our downtown was here instead of here.
And the Act 181 did make way for that.
Okay. And then the last thing, and Alex mentioned this before, and I know the work is ongoing, but, the sooner we can get, more detail on the tier 3 designation, I think the more helpful it would be for implementing our maps. Again, realizing that you're operating on a different timeline, but.
It ain't gonna work for Central Vermont if you're coming in the fall, sorry. But if you want to reschedule and come to us next year,
There you go.
I'd be happy to do that. I'm not sure if I can get the rest of the board. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, Lamoille.
Lamoille, hey, well, I'm super happy the heat is on, but I'm gonna compete against the
Is it
roar.
heat or is it
Or
cold?
ice, it's not cooling, it's cooling over there. Thanks so much. We have a presentation that we wanted to talk about, the characteristics of the region that's driving our mapping and talk about some of the experiences with community. But I wanted to address some of the issues that came up in the previous presentation, and hopefully I'll remember them all. But first, we're really, really pleased and appreciative of the board and the staff working with the regional planning commissions on the methodology. We really feel like this methodology and the fact that you looked at a lot of the details, it really helped us with our mapping. So we think that's super, and it's such an important tool for us. I totally get why you want one RPC a month. And I appreciate it. I only ask that maybe you let us stack up a bit next year, because none of us want to be right at the end in case there are any issues because of the loss of designation, which is so.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. We do extensive infrastructure planning with our communities, but in reference to Central's plight, we did have a village where a fired water system operator took plans. So that was very interesting. So I think we're back on track with understanding the capacity in that community, but things still happen. And we have engaged in extensive public outreach. We kind of knew that we had to do that upfront for everything to work. We've been meeting with communities. We have over 200 surveys back. But our surveys and our outreach is really related a lot to the mission and vision of our plan. Our land use planning is really driven by meeting with our communities, looking at their town plans. We always built our land use map. We ramped up looking at the towns and working with the towns. And I think that's really, really important. As we go forward. And so on those notes, our presentation, I'm just going to touch quickly on some of the main points before staff dives into detail. Lamoille does have some unique characteristics. One is that we're the cloudiest county in the country, and I thought about that a lot last month, but that's not what we're going to talk about here. One is flooding. We have narrow river valleys, and many of our historic centers have flooded, and that's going to drive some of our policy making around the centers. Two, we really lack water and wastewater capacity. Steph is going to go into that a lot more. And three, we have in our smaller communities have tremendous amount of land in progress, which will also drive a lot of our mapping in the smaller communities. So on that, take it away, Steph.
Sure. So the first thing kind of touched on before is that the region has challenging topography for development, transportation, for housing. One of our staff several years ago did an analysis that found, in addition to being the cloudiest county, we are also the bumpiest county in the state of Vermont. That has contributed, especially over the last several years, to significant flooding throughout the region. and a growing goal to shift village centers and downtowns away from floodplains. So that's the first theme you'll see in our future land use update. We're also hearing, as we do our outreach to the region in the rural towns, a very common thread and important priority of maintaining and strengthening active working lands. So that's meaning active land in agriculture and forestry, and private ownership and private management. We'll see a significant amount of land that is privately owned is in current use, as well as a significant amount of state-owned land throughout the region. And then the third major theme is that many of the towns have extremely major limitations on growth due to infrastructure. So we added up the available wastewater, not available, permitted design wastewater capacity of all of the sewage treatment plants and indirect discharge systems that are publicly managed in Lamoille County. And there is less capacity available in the entire region than the city of Essex Junction. And that's the difference of 2 million gallons per day countywide versus 3.3 million gallons per day Essex Junction. To get to 2 million, I had to include the 30,000 gallons per day that will be available in Wolcott when their indirect discharge system is built in 2027. And if you remove the town of Stowe, it's about 1 million of that 2 million. And then the privately owned Smuggler's Notch wastewater system is another 160,000. So we actually, in terms of available public wastewater capacity, not including Stowe, have less than 800,000 gallons per day countywide. Compare that to some of the larger plants in some of the larger regions. We did not do this with water because water is more complicated to get a number like this, as we've just spent a lot of time talking. So if we go to the next slide, this gives you a picture of that topography. And people settled in Lamoille County. They settled the land that was the easiest to access, the easiest to clear, the easiest to farm. That meant along those narrow river valleys. Now we are seeing many of the villages that have built up over time becoming increasingly vulnerable to flooding. In addition to being the cloudiest county, the bumpiest county, back in 2022, we were rated as the safest county in the country. I think it's questionable whether experience is following with that. It may be safer if we were in one of the bumpy green zones, however, which is something we're discussing in the land use map update. We can go on to the next slide. So the 2023 and 2024 flood events are very much shaping this update to the regional plan. We're going to be thinking about them with the future land use map, and we're also taking a closer look at other sections of the regional plan, like the flood resiliency section. So just to highlight this, something that a longtime member of one of our local select boards pointed out is that 3 out of the 5 largest recorded flood events have occurred in the last 2 years. That means something for planning. There are large areas of our current designated centers, existing settlements, and sewer service areas are located in vulnerable locations. And the result of that, or a result of that, is from these past 2 years of floods, we're looking at 36 FEMA associated buyouts. That's not total units. Many of those are multifamily. If we go to the next slide, you see the epicenter of this in the village of Johnson. 2/3 of Johnson's existing designated center is in a FEMA mapped floodplain or a river corridor. And in fact, that understates the risk of that kind of crossroads area. It was actually one of the areas that had a lot of flooding because the 2023 flood exceeded the 100-year floodplain by quite a bit. And we see this repeat itself in many other villages as well.
And so the library got moved out of there?
The library, can I point?
Yeah.
Can I do planner pointing?
Yes.
So the library moved from here to here. And so you see that shift potentially of the center of gravity of Johnson Village starting to be in this safer area.
So for those online, Seth is pointing to the northeast quadrant of the map.
And this, we'll see this is called Legion Field. It's kind of an open green space off the current main street, but near the school. And this is College Hill, which is where the Vermont State University is. And so that shift to kind of higher, safer ground, the library move that happened. And if you have not had an opportunity to look at social media of a library on wheels crossing a bridge, you should do that this afternoon when you're there.
And I'll also add one thing that Seth has been really successful in, and it's like 10 years now, is that we do have a very good model of. And
Of the FEMA.
No, not FEMA, that built by grants that we've sought.
Okay.
And everything. And this actually turned out to be super important because we got our FEMA maps and looked at the FEMA map for Johnson. And they showed that flooding, there'd be less flooding in the future. They were wrong.
Is that FEMA or is that
This
your
is
model?
old FEMA and.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. And so, but so we have to be careful with the FEMA maps because we ended up with A&R writing to the head of Region 1 and the delegation getting involved for them to pull the maps back because they're poorly done. And so we're working very hard with the state to try and get river modeling along the Winooski and other areas because it has informed our planning decisions so much in terms of working with communities. When we could say if we do this project, what happens? How does this impact the ability of the center? But one of the policy takeaways is certainly that our centers will probably be bigger and going in different directions, probably up.
that is a great segue to the next slide. So, since and prior to the 2020, we worked very closely with the municipalities on their local hazard mitigation plans, integrating those plans into their land use plans, and most recently, working to secure funding for hazard mitigation through these very large, potentially, though with the number of buyouts not as large as you thought this time last year, round of funding for hazard mitigation. Our region alone will be submitting 5 applications for projects to reduce flooding or better protect the communities from flooding, totaling $10 million about. But through our modeling efforts that Tasha mentioned, through our engagement with communities, we identified at least 40 additional potential future projects with a need of at least $70 million. And that $70 million does not include implementation costs of some major projects. So in addition to sewer and water infrastructure, there's an emergency flood mitigation need. Part of how we are shaping this that Tasha mentioned is that we are working with the other RPCs and RDCs in northern Vermont along the Lamoille watershed to update the hydraulic modeling we've done in Lamoille County and expand that into Northeast Kingdom and Franklin County. And you'll see on the next slide the map that shows the extent of that modeling work. And in addition to looking at flood mitigation projects, this is also going to be used to identify and help communities identify where safer areas of the world. So we can go to the next slide now. This is that additional theme. Belvedere is up high outside of the floodplain. There's no infrastructure in Belvedere, and most of the land is in current use. That big area in the center, I learned, is not in current use, but is conserved. And so there's very limited available land area for development in a community like Belvedere, but there's still a desire to ensure that there's private management and active working lands in Belvedere. The next slide shows that this isn't just a unique one-town experience. This is the town of Eden, You see a very similar trend.
So Seth, is the tan,
Yep, the shaded tan is all current land that is
current
currently.
use? Okay.
Yeah,
And actually, I'm glad I'm with this slide and going back to the methodology for a second. Thank you also for having this category that lets us deal with unusual things because we came to the conclusion, we're just gonna call the asbestos mine the asbestos because it does not fit into any of the categories. And we were able to use the language in 181 that just said this is a unique scenario. I understand Chittenden has something like they have firing range, just, things that don't fit into any and aren't going to be properly used for any future landings.
so this is the draft of where we stand currently with the future land use map. The areas have been developed based on the methodology as well as based on input from the municipalities. You'll see the speckles of white. We anticipate a lot of those speckles of white will ultimately end up in the rural general category, but there are also areas where there's question and the need for municipal input and input from other stakeholders in the region on specific appropriate land use areas. We go to the next slide. One of the tools that statute and the methodology has provided is this transition zone. We anticipate that our future land use map will have transition zones in many of the communities, especially the flood impacted communities. The statute explicitly talks about the transition zones as adjacent areas for migration and migration. For all the issues Central was talking about, we are not going to be able to fully say this is where sewer and water will extend over the next 15 years, or this is where we will plan for their new center or their expanded center. What we've tried to do is look at those areas, especially in the flood impacted communities, where it is reasonable that they may, recognizing that there will be a lot of planning to figure out what wastewater capacity do they need, what land use rules and regulations do they need, what other upgrades do they need to do that. So that's a feature we want to highlight for you. And because we're in this area, talked internally to LCPC and some initial discussions. We anticipate no tier 1B.
Tier 1A.
Tier 1A will be in our region. 2 tier 1B, possibly a third. But many of the village areas are still going to be in tier 2. And so it will be important to recognize the importance of those villages to accommodating and meeting local and regional staples in the context of tier 2.
Is that because those towns do not wish to opt in, or they just can't meet the statutory criteria?
In some cases, the first, in some cases.
Okay.
The latter. And then this, we've talked about the importance of the active working land. This is anticipation of the likely ag and forestry future land use area, which you see will cover an extensive amount of the region, and reflecting that goal that many of our growth have expressed about maintaining those active, privately managed urban forests. So the 3 big takeaways are this need to expand our villages and downtowns out of a floodplain, utilizing the transition zones to aid in that process and to allow development to be intentionally directed outside of the floodplain. And then that current use is driving a large amount of work and discussion in the region. And this brings us to the question slide, which is, there's some additional slides after if you have questions.
Right.
Yes.
And the only other point I just wanted to add, because we haven't had a chance to talk about this, is to share, we've met with a lot of our communities. We anticipate meeting with select boards more than once. Some communities will probably take 3 or 4 visits.
Yeah.
And then we also have staff meeting with the planning commission. So there's real good knowledge and community of what we're doing. We do have some rural communities who are not enthused. And they have been, I think, thoughtful and respectful when we have visited with them, but they have been very clear that they have concerns that this mapping will lead to statewide zoning or increased regulation in their communities. And they all told me to come and talk about that. The thing who I was coming here, but I just wanted to, make you aware that the reception is very different in very different types of communities. We have a lot of communities that zoning.
Are you hearing that they are afraid that, if you map something in that rural conservation category, that it's going to be tier 3?
Yes.
Yeah.
We were recently in a community where someone was saying, that's green, make it yellow, because they want it to be a rural general. And they
So-
did that, yeah.
I mean, if you can, when you go back, tell them that the only categories that have jurisdictional implications for Act 250 are the centers and the neighborhoods, or the downtown centers, the village centers, the planned growth areas, and the village areas. Those are the only 4 land use, future land use categories that have implications for Act 250.
So the concern that they have expressed is that if some property is found in tier 3, that there will be additional criteria or lower thresholds for activity.
Yeah.
And that's what.
Yes, that's what tier 3 is about,
Right,
but it doesn't have anything to do with your map.
right. but
It's
that's-
mapping
yes.
that we are doing, and that's what the stakeholder meetings that Alex is spearheading are about.
You
And
should invite them all to the May 22nd public
Yeah.
meeting, so they.
So
can
that would
share
be
this.
so exciting for you. So, but I say, and we constantly say, yes, the tiers are not on our maps. We're very aware of that. The
but
tiers
not only are they not on them, your boundaries will have no relationship to them,
To the tier 3
Except-
anyways, yeah.
except for those 4 downtown categories, the center categories.
So let's talk about that because, I mean, that's really helpful information. But for them, it feels like, oh, you're calling it conservation. That suggests it's valuable. That suggests there might be oversight. That's how they're making that connection between rural conservation and tier 3. And so you can see how they get.
Yeah, oh, absolutely,
Yep.
and, but
Yeah.
But that's what you can say. That's not, and, as far as I'm concerned, those 3 rural categories, I mean, they're meaningless to what we're doing. And I don't know how meaningful they are to you. When I was still at BCRC, I was like, this is ridiculous. What-
I like your candor.
So it's, if they don't want to call it conservation at a local level, then don't.
Well, we have to follow the methodology.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And we've
but
been
you
clear
can
with
also
them.
say where you don't.
Yeah.
You can say
Yeah.
we deviated here because Eden was dead set against calling anything conservation or something like that.
They told me I was boiling a frog, but they were very
Yeah.
polite about
Yeah.
it. And, well, that's.
I mean, I don't know if it was Eden. I
Yeah,
just
well,
picked
no,
that,
but it wasn't just Eden. I
Yeah.
think that's, that there are a lot of communities without zoning. And so this is super helpful, but
Mhm.
we wanted to say something to that.
Well, I think that the distinctions between the 3 areas of the statute is not significant, but the distinction in terms of what the words mean to some people is very significant. And in many of the rural communities in our region, there is a very strongly held belief that conservation is a private landowner decision. And for us to, therefore, as the region, map land is conserved where the landowner hasn't consented to being conserved is making a suggestion of something that maybe not the intent of that mapping, but really
Right.
how it would be received. And the importance of planning representing sort of the desires of the local community, which in this case is usually that local or that working land with private landowner decision making. does not in any way mean to suggest there are not conservation values. And that will be something in the text of the policies of the need to work towards.
I mean, I think the methodology gives you some leeway to do that
Yeah.
in those towns. And so,
Yeah, so I think it'll be very, and you know, since we don't know about tier 3, I think that's part of the thing.
and,
know.
I think if they were paying attention to Alex's previous, presentations and what's coming out of the tier 3 discussions is probably not gonna be very expensive. Maybe. I mean, we don't know yet.
Already,
But
that,
it's not gonna be this,
Right.
it's not gonna be the monster that everybody's worried about.
But at the same time, part of our conversation with A&R has circled a little bit around the new road rule or the old road rule that is now back as of July of next year. And so I will be interested, because I think it'll come up during the tier 3 public meetings, to what extent rural communities that are cautious about increased Act 250 jurisdiction, to what extent they understand how much was baked into that through the road rule. Because I think especially in your region, it's a lot. Unlike the tier 3 area, which like Janet was implying, might be a more targeted area of increased Act 250 jurisdiction. The road rule is not targeted. It is a blunt mechanism, and I think there are a lot of your communities that are gonna be subject to it.
And that's the monster.
Yeah. And
So we still have a monster.
I think you could see how in a rural community, the language of, because this general rural, working lands rural, or conservation rural might play to what is allowed beyond the road rule and how my criteria can be applied.
For sure.
So I think that even though we, when we're sitting here looking at the policies and the different pieces, if there's a hydra, they're seeing all the heads.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we're all speaking the same language as planners,
Yeah.
but conservation districts generally at the municipal level tended to be those areas that were already conserved, already in public ownership. It was rare for a community to map a part of town that was privately owned as a conservation district. Some communities do it, but not very many. And so like Janet, I have a similar impression about the regional future land use maps with the 3 rural categories, at least in the community I used to represent before I left and came to this board. I'm like, seems like most of it's rural ag and forest and maybe some rural general. I don't see a lot of rural conservation in this town, for that very reason.
And we really appreciate that you are taking these planning considerations into account, because, we really want to do the absolute right thing with our land use map, and we also really want to be respectful and thoughtful dealing with all of them.
And so I think what's gonna be helpful for us when you come to us is that you document that on the RPC checklist. There's that section for the future land use mapping, and it says you followed the mapping or you didn't, you deviated, and here's how, and just put that in there.
Yeah.
Is there time for another question?
Yeah.
I would love to know more about the hazardous mitigation project funding. What specific projects, like where they are, so in the grand scheme of advancing that work, like $10 million, and I think the other number was $70 million, is not insignificant. And I'm just trying to get a kind of reality gauge on like what that's looking like. I don't know if we want to go back to that slide if there's time.
So we have $10 million in projects. I mean, that's a great question. A large part of the hazard mitigation money that's currently available is going to be eaten up by the buyouts. Maybe almost all of it. But we're hopeful that there will be some for hazard mitigation. And that process will continue.
So
So that's the 70 million or the 10?
So the $10 million is infrastructure retrofits excluding buyouts. The $70 million is sort of a estimate of other projects that communities have identified through the public processes need. And
But not currently funded.
but not currently have. Okay. And the 10 millioners, you know, are pending application, they're not full lists.
So it's all,
So,
yeah, and then we also want to see, I mean, it's, you know, you can see how this happened, but it's just very, too bad that the Johnson wastewater treatment plant run by the village had good water in it. They wanted to move this plant. And they voted at the end of the day to leave it where it is because FEMA will pay you to where it is. And they won't pay the difference if you move it, and they could not on it. They were looking at a possible $15 additional million, and they had no sense of it. So we can end on that depressing note.
Yeah.
or we can have a-
Anybody got a happier note? Seth, come on.
I can,
You do it.
was so, hopefully this is a happy note. Sometimes I say happy things that I think are happy, but they're not. But, you know, among each of those 5 projects in that request are part of the or were initially identified in our flood modeling work. One of them is a follow-up to the Village of Jeffersonville's evaluation report after Hurricane Irene. The outcome of that work is in the Halloween 2019 storm, the December 2023 storm, and the anniversary storm of July 2024. The village was largely dry. Senior housing had been evacuated twice in the 2010s. Everyone was safe. July 2023 was a big event, you know, a record event. Eventually, the capacity of those were exceeded, but there was 43 extra minutes to evacuate the senior housing, and that meant it happened after sunrise as opposed to in the evening. So each of these, and that's a big deal. When you hear from first responders that seconds count, and there's a lot of seconds in order to answer. What we're trying to do with this planning method is to get as many seconds as we can. And we've shown and we've seen that we can do that. And what we're trying to do with the land use map is tie all the pieces together, the land use planning, the infrastructure planning, and the mitigation planning to make these communities as safe as they can.
Congratulations, that's awesome. That is a good note. Yeah.
Mhm.
And we've come to a 10-minute break point, which now it's only 8 minutes, but.
Okay, we're done.
We're done.
But
All right, we're unmuted and it's still recording.
Okay. So we are back from a break. Next on our agenda is an opportunity for public comments on non-agenda items. We have, most of our guests have left, but Thomas is still here. Do you have any comments, Thomas?
Thank you for the opportunity. I have no comment.
Okay, I see that Annette has one.
Yes, this is a comment probably for Sarah. The Tier 1A document that you put together references enforcement, and the law is says that you're supposed to assure the capacity of the municipality. This is an issue I raised when the legislation was being considered, because it looked to me like a pretty major cost shift from state level enforcement, which exists, to town enforcement, which I think has always been a problem. So have you thought about how to assure that a municipality has the capacity or the capability to do enforcement?
So I think what you're speaking to directly is under adequate staffing. And so under the criteria that we have for both Tier 1A and B, there's a requirement that a municipality has to show adequate staffing to be able to carry out these provisions. And I think where we're looking at that is there isn't a whole lot more to what adequate staffing means in terms of, is it an adequate number of people? Is it adequate training? Is all of the above? And so I think that's a very good question. I think that's one that we, as we begin in some of the conversations we have, is we're recognizing that that's going to look different across the broad spectrum of communities that we anticipate working with. And that's something that we will need to have communities address through their application process and to inform us of how they are going to tackle these things. There is also the requirement, I think, as was discussed previously today, about having an idea of check-ins. And the state sets a parameter of at least 4 years, but we can ask for check-ins more frequently than that. We can also ask for annual reporting. So I think those are some of the things that we're thinking about right now. Still working on another version of the memo, and so that's to be continued. But still happy to hear what some thoughts are from people, and so please feel free to email them. But just that's an area that I think we're looking at. It's going to be a broad spectrum.
So
yeah, and that, Alex, I think that in my mind, communities that have no Act 250 permits to manage within, an area of Tier 1A exemption are one type of community, and communities that have lots are another kind of community, at least in my mind. And I would hope, I would expect, as just one board member, that communities that are going to be taking over lots and lots of Act 250 permit administration because of their Tier 1A, that they speak to that along the lines of what Sarah said, in terms of adequate staffing. You have enough to deal with it.
From my experience, where I've seen zoning permits issued and then violated, adequate staffing means the money to pay a lawyer. And that's where enforcement usually breaks down. A lot of permits that are well-intentioned and are not then complied with. That's the part of it that it's not so much about staffing, it's about how do you pay a lawyer. So budgeting is how I view it. Most towns don't have budgets for court or to pay a lawyer to go to court. So I just wanted to sow that seed because it's something that's bothered me all along. And I don't do that much with zoning. I try and steer clear of it, actually, but I am aware of especially, some of the smaller towns, and to your point, Alex, maybe they won't have Act 250 applications, and want to do a Tier 1A. But for those that do, I think this is a really important aspect, because we are losing, or those municipalities are losing, the benefit of Act 250's enforcement state level program. And that's all I have today. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say too, that I think with the other requirements of Tier 1A, that you are going to find that these are probably not going to be the smaller towns. While there could be a broad array, these are probably going to be some of the larger, more robust planning towns that we have. When you take a look at the designated downtowns and things of that nature, and some of which actually even have their own legal staff on hand. So we shall see. It should be a broad spectrum, but I think point taken.
Thank you, Annette. Next on the agenda, consent agenda, we have the April 17th and the April 21st minutes to consider.
I'll make a motion to approve both sets of minutes with any revisions that we might discuss.
Second.
Great, thank you. Any comments, questions, or recommended revisions on the minutes?
I have one.
Oh,
I had
you do?
one.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Do you need to look at them?
I need to pull up mine because I took a note.
Oh, you
The
did?
note's not on your computer.
okay.
Good try though. But maybe you can help me remember while I'm typing away here. This was a comment made by Charlie Baker, who was with the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. And it was in reference to a Tier 3 discussion. We were discussing Tier 3, so it could not have been April 17th because I wasn't there. Had to have been the April 21st meeting. And I think the minutes say that, thank you, Charlie Baker, and it says the legislature did not include prime ag soil because the whole city of St. Albans qualifies. And I think that should be reworded.
Maybe,
And I have a proposal for that.
Okay.
I just have to find it here. Sorry for the hiccup.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what Charlie said there when I read that in the minutes.
I think
I
he was
remember what he
using
said.
it as an example.
Exactly. So let me just give you my proposed rewording for Rebecca to perhaps
Okay.
use if you all agree.
Okay.
Hold on one more moment. Okay, so I would recommend revising that to say, where are we here?
It's out under the 3:12 PM.
Yes.
Comment.
So
Charlie Baker.
revise that to say Charlie Baker recommended caution if considering prime ag soils for Tier 3, period. He noted that the whole city of St. Albans is mapped as prime ag soils. period.
That's right. That's what he said. Got it.
I agree.
So we all agreed. Rebecca, did you catch that?
I got it.
You did.
I got it.
Okay.
Did you get it?
So, yeah, Maddie has it if you didn't get it, Rebecca. Any further comments or questions or changes to the minutes? All those in favor of, the motion to approve both sets of minutes with that correction, please say aye.
Aye.
That is unanimous. Thank you. Okay, now we have discussion and possible action on appeals, enforcement, and attorney-client memoranda. We have a motion for that.
I'll move that we go into an executive session with our legal counsel to discuss pending appeals, enforcement actions, or obtain other legal advice on pending cases. Premature public disclosure of which would be prejudicial to the board members. On docket number 24 EMB 00082.
Yeah, in particular.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That's unanimous. So we will be going into executive session. We may come out with a decision about docket number 24-ENB-00082. Otherwise, we will adjourn after that. So where are we going? Okay.
It's all how it's talking.
All right, you're unmuted and recording.
Thank you. So we are returning from an executive session. Was it Sarah? You have a motion?
I move to reject the April 21st, 2025 settlement offer received in docket number 24-ENB-82.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. And that's all we have for you today, folks.
I'll move to adjourn.
Thank you. I'll second. Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 That's 5. Thank you, everybody. See you next time, which is not Thursday.
Yes.
It is Thursday.
Oh, it is Thursday.
Yes.
It's next week we don't have.